You're listening to the Men's Dating Mastery Podcast with host Alec Chase, bringing you the experts in dating, sex, and relationships.
Welcome back to another episode of MDM. Today, I have a different kind of episode for you guys. Normally, I focus the conversation on extracting specific insights that you can apply directly to improving your dating, sex, and relationship lives. Today's conversation is more informational, although it is still highly relevant to most men's personal lives. We're talking about porn. And before you make any assumptions, let me just tell you that what you're going to hear in this episode is probably not what you think or heard before. I have no doubt that you have stumbled upon plenty of warnings about the detrimental effects of watching pornography on men's well-being. With the recent rise in porn addiction advocacy groups and various NoFap movements, this point of view has been propagated throughout the media and all over the internet. So it is a great privilege that I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Nicole Prause, who is a sexual psychophysiologist and is highly respected in her field. Nicole, along with her colleague Dr. James Faust, recently published the first ever scientific study on the relationship between porn consumption, erectile dysfunction, and sexual desire. I was shocked to learn that despite all the claims about porn leading to issues in these two departments, that no scientific study had ever been conducted to back the claims. Nicole explains her findings and how she came about them, and I also ask her to comment on some of the other commonly claimed detriments of watching pornography, including the claim that porn addiction is like drug addiction, whether porn physically alters the brain, if watching porn leads to negative behavior towards women, including violence, if porn makes men insecure, which in turn drives them deeper into porn use and away from real-life women, whether porn makes you lazy and actually hurts your chances with women in the real world, and if porn makes men less attracted to real-life women. These are some of the commonly named issues that are associated with watching pornography. I won't give anything away, but let's just say that the insights that Nicole shares are not ones that you're likely to find anywhere else. And for once, they're actually coming from an unbiased source and from someone with over 10 years of research behind her. I found this conversation very illuminating, and it has changed my understanding of adult films. If you have ever wondered about how porn consumption may be affecting you, and whether all those negative claims are actually true, then I strongly encourage you to listen because, like I said, this is not information that is broadly available. Make sure that you listen all the way to the end as well because we get into the real heart of the matter towards the second half of the episode. If you do like this episode, then please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. That is enough for me. Here's Dr. Nicole Prause. Hi, Nikki. Thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Can you spend a few moments introducing yourself and the kind of work you do?
Sure. So I'm a sexual psychophysiologist, which means I study the connection between the brain and the genitalia in humans, mostly understanding why some people have high sexual motivation, others have low, and how we each get ourselves into trouble with those respective ends. So I was an associate research scientist at UCLA and recently have started a new company that's in the UCLA startup program that's focused on brain stimulation and treating sexual desire problems.
Okay, fantastic. And the name of your study is, or the ones that we're going to be discussing today, is Viewing Sexual Stimuli Associated with Greater Sexual Responsiveness, Not Erectile Dysfunction. So we're essentially talking about the effect of watching pornography on men specifically. And there have been a lot of publications that preceded this one, but they generally focus on the negative effects of watching pornography. So before we get into how you conducted your study and what your findings were, can you just briefly mention what you know of the studies that preceded you? So what did they focus on? What were their conclusions? And as well as talk a little bit about how those studies were conducted, whether or not there are any holes in them.
So broadly, the research on sex films is fairly mixed. So if you sit someone down in front of a sex film, you're going to have them say that they feel sexually aroused, probably. They'll probably also say they're happy, joyous, amused, all of those things. But then to some extent, they'll also say they're shameful, guilty, and depressed. So just as a start, sex films tend to evoke a very mixed emotional state. It's very rarely pure, as it is, for instance, with anger or sadness. Usually those emotions we would say are a little more pure. So the outcome, I think, of viewing sex films over time is kind of consistent with that viewpoint. So there are some negative effects. That is, in older studies, we've seen, for example, people report less satisfaction with their relationship, being more dissatisfied with their own body and with their partner's body. More recently, there seems to be a little bit of a shift in that. So my speculation is that some of the changes in the negative effects might be due to the bigger discussions we're having about sex films. That is, people, I think, now view them, at least adults do, more clearly as fantasy material and don't hold themselves up to that standard. So, for example, now men who watch more sex films do not report less satisfaction with their own penis size. They don't report less satisfaction with their relationship. So as much as there has been some research before on some of these mixed effects, there's also a lot of shifts occurring. And I think that's just to do with some of the availability that is provoking discussions and having people actually talk about those issues.
Just to clarify, are you suggesting that maybe those studies were not accurate or correct in their findings, or rather that how people approach those films to begin with is changing, so the mind frame of the viewer is changing?
I think the latter is the case, that there's some maturation around how we think about and view those type of films now.
And what about with respect to how those studies were conducted? I was reading in your paper that there might have been some issues with them. So, for example, some of them might have focused on patients rather than totally healthy individuals, or perhaps sample data wasn't large enough, anything of that nature?
Sure. Well, there are always, anytime a study is published, there's always something you could have done. Could have had a bigger sample, could have sampled women also if it was a male-focused study. So we don't know very much about the effect of sex films on women viewing, for example. We don't know much about different sexual orientations, and there are a lot of questions of causality. So, for example, there was a much-touted study this last year that talked about having areas of the brain that were relatively smaller in people who viewed more sex films, and the headlines, of course, said porn shrinks your brain. And of course, that's not what the author said, but there's kind of that basic misunderstanding that I don't know if it's so much the flaws in some of the scholarship itself as the way that it gets interpreted over time and then represented in media as more of a concern.
Okay. So it's not necessarily that, the researchers are to blame. It's more media misrepresentation.
Yeah, we probably don't help in some cases. It's hard to know sometimes when you need to clarify something. And yeah, sometimes I see headlines afterwards. I'm like, oh man, it's not what you intended. So
yeah, well, and the media is always looking for sound bites that'll elicit the largest response, right? So there's also that bias.
Sure, sex does that.
Mm-hmm. So what about your study? What did you set out to find out first?
We had been seeing quite a lot of media coverage and writing online about people that were concerned that viewing pornography or viewing sex films was contributing to erectile dysfunction and for people no longer wanting to have sex with their actual intimate partner. And this seemed to us to be unlikely for a number of different reasons, but we kind of had data available. That is, I've been in the field over 10 years, and you, over time, just test a lot of guys eventually. And I said, you know what? I have some measures on all these guys of their erectile functioning, and I'd collected information about their erotica viewing as well. We could answer this question by not collecting any new data. I have a sufficient amount here to actually go and look at that. So we call that a secondary data analysis. And so that's what we ultimately did, was kind of gathered of all the data that I had in my laboratory. whatever guys we could find that had all the relevant data points, and tried to examine whether there was any association with the amount of erotica they were viewing and either their erectile functioning with a partner or their desire for their partner.
Okay. And can you talk a little bit about the participants themselves? So how many, what were their characteristics, young, old, healthy, clinical conditions, anything like that?
Sure. These were 280 men, and they had the typical problem skew in the sense that they are the college sophomore age by and large, common critique of psychological studies. In this case, I think that's not as much of a problem because that's usually about the age where people are claiming that this happens. That is, that those younger men are supposedly having increased rates of erectile dysfunction, so it may not be a problem for that reason. And then in some of our analyses, we wanted to make sure, for example, when we asked guys about their erectile functioning with a partner, to make clear that their current erotica viewing, whether or not it was related. So we needed to limit in some of those analyses to just guys that had an active sexual partner, and I believe it was 127 in that subsample. So for overall, just looking at, for instance, desire and whether or not they were continuing to respond to sex films in the lab, we had a larger sample, but then for some of it, we used a subsample that had active partners.
Okay, so let's talk about your findings now, and this is where I would really like to spend most of our conversation, is to talk about what you found as well as some suggestive findings. So not necessarily conclusive findings, but things that your discoveries might imply.
Okay, so maybe one of the primary findings is the direct relationship between how much they were viewing sex films on average per week. We measure that in their reported hours of viewing, which is a common metric. You could certainly use others, but it's a fairly common one. And the erectile functioning with their partner. And the funny thing there is there was no relationship. That is, we could not find a significant relationship. And whenever that happens, you always have to say, well, did you have enough people to see it had it been there? So we did some fancy stats to make sure that that was the case. That is, if there was a relationship, did we have enough guys in our sample to see it had it been there, and concluded that we did, at least to a relatively small effect. So it's always difficult. You can't prove a null, but we did check, and we could not find a relationship in our sample between the amount of erotica they were viewing and their erectile function. And on the other side of that is the drive for a partner. So this idea that if you watch a lot of sex films, you're going to not want to be with a woman anymore, maybe, or a guy, or that you might become less responsive to the sex films themselves. That is, you might develop some tolerance for it perhaps over time. And these findings are more interesting because we actually found that they were in the opposite of the direction predicted by sex and porn addiction advocates. So the more they were viewing sex films, the higher their sexual desire for a partner, and also the more responsive, that is, the more sexual arousal they reported in the laboratory studies where they were viewing erotica. So, we can't, again, this is an association study, so we can't say one caused the other necessarily, but it makes it very hard to imagine that if we did a causal study, for instance, following guys over time, that effect would suddenly flip its direction. It's unlikely. So this isn't a final comment on the potential causality there, but it seems extremely unlikely given that the effect that we did find was in the wrong direction and was fairly strong.
Right. So what you're saying is that we were to ask the question whether or not the sample size was large enough. The answer is, well, it probably is, because a larger sample size would not necessarily help because it would actually have to reverse the direction of this relationship.
It's in there, yeah. You got to get little stats in to get that one. But yeah, it's basically if it had been there, we should have been able to see it. And we did not see a relationship with erectile functioning. And what we did find was in the reverse of the direction predicted by sex addiction models.
Is this the largest sample size that anyone's ever done on a study of this nature?
It's actually the first study looking at the relationship between erotica viewing and erectile functioning data.
Oh. Okay.
So yeah, so it's kind of an easy, and just by chance, I didn't realize a colleague of ours was collecting very similar data out of Croatia, and so a week later they published, and I forget, he had a much larger sample size actually. They published a study a week after ours that replicated our data beautifully. I was quite relieved to see that. You always want to see replication in science, and so that kind of supported our conclusions that, if we had had a larger sample size, we probably would have seen the same thing. And because that's what they did. They got a completely separate larger sample and came to the same conclusions we had.
Okay, so we're basically saying that based on your study and their study, it doesn't look like there's a connection between watching erotica and erectile dysfunction. You're saying that there's actually a trend suggesting higher arousal, both in response to films as well as to real life partners, and increased desire for sex.
So we don't know about the actual arousal with the partners. I wish we could measure that here. but at least the desire for them does not seem to have waned, and it actually seems stronger, yes.
Okay, so I mean that's definitely challenges a lot of the stuff that's been in the media recently. Well, not even recently, for a few years now. Claims the opposite. What about some of the potential benefits? And I know you can't make a definitive statement that there are benefits, but you had talked about some possible benefits as a result of watching erotic. Can you talk about those?
Sure. One of the main ones perhaps depends on context. So if you're in a relationship where perhaps the sex has become less novel, so maybe a long-term relationship, and you want to broaden your sexual behaviors, so have something new to experiment with. We have some data that have shown, not from our lab, but in general, that watching sex films over time, people who watch more tend to have a broader types of sexual behavior, so they're more likely to engage in oral sex, or more likely to engage in anal sex. So if that's a goal you have, that's something that you think would benefit your relationship, then it might be a good reason to watch erotica. Similarly, we had a study where we had couples come into the laboratory. And these were folks who didn't report watching erotica before they got there. They were surprised when we told them, by the way, we're going to ask you to watch some porn together. And, couples who did that actually in our study reported that they had stronger satisfaction with their relationship with their partner, which is different from research in the past. So this is one of those cases where I think there may have been a cultural shift where these people would see the erotic films and say, yeah, that's nice, but I'm here with my partner who I love and want to be with. So this just makes me value them more because we don't have that type of whatever they don't like about the sex film, maybe the impersonality or the, we've got such a better connection than this film because they see it for what it is. That is a fantasy material and not real life. So it has that potential as well. I wouldn't say that's as well established. Whereas the broadening of behaviors is better replicated. So it's a good way to get new ideas. And if that's something your relationship is lacking or could benefit from, then might be a good time to watch.
And you also mentioned that it has the potential to change attitudes towards sex in general. So having more sex positive attitudes or just being a little bit more accepting of different sexual activities.
It does seem to broaden those attitudes, yes.
So here's what I'd like to do with you. I went online and I looked up some of the most common issues that are claimed to be associated with pornography. So I'd like to go through them, and I'd just like to get your comments on each. I'll try not to make this redundant because we already touched on a lot of them. So I'll try and skip over some of them. And just give me your thoughts. It doesn't have to come from this particular study. It could come from anything you've done in your work. And if you haven't dealt with it before, then we can just skip it. You don't have to answer anything that you don't have insights into.
I'll make my best guess.
Okay, sounds good. So number one, we've covered that. But here's number two. Porn addiction is exactly the same as drug addiction, and it escalates over time.
So there are two pieces there. The first bit is that it looks like drug addiction, and people have made that argument because watching sex films activates some areas of the brain that have been associated with reward processes. And that is, it is the case that drugs also activate those areas of the brain, but they are necessary but not sufficient. What I mean by that is chocolate also activates those areas of the brain. And in fact, your preferred chocolate brand activates those areas of the brain stronger than your non-preferred chocolate brand. And I don't think, based on that, we would make the argument, well, Nestle's is addicting, but Leonidas is not. So I think there's a basic misinterpretation there, when people say, oh, sex increases dopamine availability, or, it activates these areas of the brain, therefore it's just like drug addiction. It's just a basic misunderstanding of neuroscience. That is, they share common pathways because that's how we learn. That is, dopamine helps us to acquire new information by kind of signaling to the brain, pay attention to that. That's important. Remember that. And let's see, then the second piece you said, so it's like drug addiction and that it develops over time, I think intensifies over time. There is not good evidence for tolerance. So there have been a couple of studies where they showed people the same sex film repeatedly over time. And sometimes the anti-porn advocates will use those data and try and say, see, people get desensitized, but they are not showing novel stimuli over time. And when we've done that in the lab, we do not see decrements in sexual arousal over time. And that's not just our laboratory. So I think I don't know if it's a misunderstanding or intentional, of course, it's hard to say, but yes, if you viewed the same sex film repeatedly, your response will probably go down. We've seen that in a couple of studies, but as long as you're continuing to have novel stimuli, the response doesn't seem to dampen either within the laboratory session. And then over time, longer than that, we don't know. That is, we haven't followed people over long term. My sense is from some of the data we do have that doesn't happen, but I would say we still need more data in that area.
Just to clarify what that means with respect to novelty. So watching the same film over and over and over again will over time become less and less stimulating, but watching something new and something different is likely to continue to have the same effect. Now, when we're talking about something new, are we just talking about just different actors, slightly different scenes, or are we talking about more and more extreme, or for lack of a better word, creative scenes?
So in our lab, we actually do the former primarily. So all of our films are edited to have one man and one woman engaged in consensual vaginal intercourse, which I realize is not the Internet of Things. That is, there are some limitations on what we show for a reason. But you might expect, well, that's a situation where you certainly should see tolerance. There's very little increased novelty. There's not a lot of variability in the behaviors. And yet, people, when we show them these films one after the other, are reporting similar levels of arousal throughout the lab experience. That is, it doesn't seem to dampen over time. Which is pretty unique to sex, actually. Like even other emotional films, you'll generally see more of a decrement within the experimental session. So sex may be unique in that sense. I just don't see the evidence for the response going down while you still have novel stimuli.
Here's another one. Pornography physically changes the brain. Because it gets overwhelmed with so much dopamine in response to the porn, the brain responds by taking away some dopamine receptors. Is that true?
That has definitely never been demonstrated.
Okay.
That's an easy one. So the idea that the brain somehow gets awash in this dopamine, I've seen some people write about high dopamine state. That's not a thing, actually. It's we actually know very little about how much dopamine changes and at what stage of sexual response it changes. So, for example, we think that it spikes, the dopamine that is spikes at orgasm, but that's primarily from a study that used cerebral spinal fluid, which we don't know how that relates to what's in the brain. And then a couple of PET studies, and those can't image the brain at orgasm. So in all these cases, we may just be looking at high arousal states. It could be something else entirely. It's very, very hard to measure the brain at orgasm, and even in those high arousal states. Usually we're studying people that are a much lower arousal level in the lab. So, on the one hand, I don't think we know enough to make any statement even close to that. But even if we did, I'm not sure how people think kind of that we'd say endogenously generated. So as where with substances, they're exogenous. It's something you put into your body and may overclock your system, if you like the computer analogy. With erotica, that's something that your body is generating on its own. So the idea that it's going to be toxic to itself without some physical pathology, there's not a good precedent for that. I mean, there are diseases that can cause those kinds of problems, but everything you can encounter changes the brain. That's called learning. And there is no problem with learning. It should happen. It means you're healthy. So the idea that watching porn changes your brain, of course it does. It should. The idea that it's going to somehow overwhelm and overclock your dopamine system, there's no good evidence for, and there's reason to think it doesn't happen.
Okay. Here's the next one. Porn watchers tend to gravitate towards more extreme versions of it over time, which leads them to start accepting extreme behavior as normal, and in turn can lead to negative behavior towards the opposite sex, including things such as actual physical violence.
Yeah, so there are two pieces there. One is the increasing interest or acceptance of different sexual behaviors, and I touched on that a little bit. That does seem to happen, and I'm mainly relying on one study there that kind of watched people over a brief period of time that went from watching more kind of consensual acts, and they had surveyed the main area people expanded into, and their study was bondage, but that may have just been because that was what they asked about. Of course, it's hard to know. So it could be a limitation of the study in that sense. And the issue with kind of degradation of respect for the opposite sex, and then also violence tendencies, there is evidence that watching erotica can increase people's, we would call them rape myths or rape attitudes. So that is, if I go out with a woman and I buy her dinner, she owes me, like endorsing that kind of a statement. But it happens in people who are already higher on those scales. So if you are someone who has, a strong sense already, so you score low on rape myths, we would say, watching a lot of erotica does not shift your needle on those scales.
So is what you're suggesting that correlation is not necessarily causation? Is that it?
Well, I think we have some data showing that erotic films can cause a shift in people who are predisposed. In this case, I think it's a person-situation interaction. So just by virtue of seeing those doesn't mean you're going to start hating the opposite sex. You're going to start being disrespectful. I think it's, if you already kind of trend that way, then you see something that you feel justifies some of your beliefs, even though other people around you don't believe it. You maybe feel more justified, those type of things. So I could see that negative effect being there, and really, in the same way you would not, you don't want anyone watching child pornography, but you especially probably don't want people who are thinking they might have that interest viewing a lot of it, if it might encourage them that direction. We don't know if it does or not, but it's kind of the same idea. That is, if someone is already not being very sex positive and is having some trouble kind of identifying consent and being clear about consent issues with their partner, I don't know that you want them seeing things that act out what they think is already appropriate and kind of justifying or promoting their attitudes.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to skip over a few of them. I'll just touch on a couple of last ones, just in the interest of time. Here's one that says, porn makes men insecure. So by seeing guys with large penises, men become more insecure about themselves, which leads to anxiety around women, which drives them deeper into porn use and away from real life women.
There are two data points that are opposite of that. And I actually just recently became aware of one of them myself, because honestly, the first part would have been my assumption as well. These actors are presumably selected for their phallus size. So it's at least in part. So it's it stands to reason that might make you feel insecure if that's all you're seeing. You think that's the norm. But what these two studies found, one found that there was no relationship between men's satisfaction with their own genital size and the amount of erotica they were viewing. And the other one actually found a positive relationship. That is, guys who watched more porn were more secure and said, no, my penis size is great, no problems. Now, why that is, again, these are just association studies. That surprised me, so I'm not sure.
Maybe those men had really big penises of their own.
Maybe. So they're watching because they feel secure, because that's just like them on the screen.
Right.
Possibly. I mean, the other possibility, and this is an interpretation I'm increasingly starting to like, is if people take erotica for what it is, that is a fantasy and not real sexual behavior, then they may see that as this is entertaining, this is interesting, and not I'm supposed to look like that. They see it as this actor was selected for that feature. So it is perfectly fine if I don't live up to that. One of the interesting differences is guys do tend to report less security with other masculine features, so not their penis, but their muscularity and body hair, for example, after watching erotica. So that's kind of interesting to me. I was like, well, so maybe they're watching it and thinking, I could go to the gym. There's nothing I can do about my penis size. That was what I got from my genetics, or at least there's very little without surgery that you can do. But the muscularity and the body hair is something men could do something about. So maybe that's why they're feeling less secure after watching erotica with other aspects of their physical appearance. But yeah, it's a very interesting divide. I'm not totally sure how to explain it.
Yeah, so it almost could be a little extra motivation for them to actually do something positive for themselves. And that's actually
it's a very nice spin.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to spin it. I like that. It actually made me think, because women have been dealing with this for ages, right? Because the way the female body is represented in the media, I'm going to guess here, but maybe around the 50s, 60s, society generally preferred women that were a little curvier, a little heavier. And so very skinny women felt really insecure because of what the ideal body type was represented to be in the media. And now it's kind of the flip side of that. And so women that are a little curvier start to feel insecure. So it almost sounds like a parallel to me. We rarely talk about guys having body image issues, but they do.
Oh, sure. Yeah, there seems to be an interesting flip too, in that if you looked at guys going in for penile lengthening surgeries, for example, the overwhelming majority were of normal size. They felt that they were so small that they wanted to get surgery, and yet they were perfectly within average. And now we have data showing that the same thing is happening with women in labiaplasty. So they're going in because they think they need to have that worked on, and it turns out they're quite normal as well, so far as we know. So there's a lot of insecurity on both sides, I think, about those.
Yeah, the stuff with the labia, I heard about that recently. I just thought that had to be one of the most absurd things I've ever heard.
Sorry, pick up on it.
Here's one that says that pornography makes you lazy. So we don't have to talk a lot about this one. I think you actually might have already touched on this indirectly, but essentially it says that instead of going out to meet women and have real life sex, men will just be lazy and turn to porn to satisfy their needs.
Yeah, and I know there were some data recently where they were trying to say, people are increasingly delaying marriage, and they were trying to pin it on viewing more erotic films. And, is there some of that? I don't know that even if that was happening, that it's in some cases that's necessarily a bad thing. That is, if someone, is just really wanting to be sexual and the option is go out to a bar and have a one night stand or masturbate, I would prefer they masturbate. So, for safety reasons, for just the general connection, not to say, that I don't want to judge that behavior out of hand, but from pure health risk perspective, it is physically healthier, safer, emotionally safer potentially to just be at home behaving by yourself. So making that choice is not always a bad thing, I think.
Okay. I said 2 and I've asked you 2. Do you have time for one last one?
Sure, let's go.
Okay. So this one says that men who watch porn start to find women less and less attractive in the general sense because they start to basically compare every single woman they come across to their ideal woman that they see in porn. What's your take on that?
I think the data are more mixed around that. I do feel like I've seen more support for guys who watch more erotica having preferences for larger breasts, for example, than is average in the US. So that suggests that they're going to be less satisfied physically with women that they see out in the real world. There's also strong trends in pubic hair patterns, for example, that's strongly cohort related. That is, younger women strongly tend not to have any these days. Older women strongly tend to have all of theirs. And it's interesting that the men's preferences vary pretty strongly by cohort as well. So they're saying, yes, I in fact expect to see that in my partners. So that does worry me a little bit more. I think there is some potential for increasing the pressure on the physical appearance of the women. But again, like, the studies don't consistently find that. Some do, some don't, and the effects aren't particularly overwhelming in their size. So it's not like they're devastating the female standards or something. But I do think there's more of a potential for harm there probably than most of the other areas we've talked about.
Here's what I'm thinking on this particular one. You mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation that the variety of erotic films has increased tremendously. So we were talking about men and their insecurity with respect to penis size, and, the fact that so many male actors tend to be very, very well endowed. But the reality is that now that's not really the only type of pornography you see. Now there's a lot of pornography where guys are not necessarily that large, right? And so similarly, women that are featured in porn now, they might not necessarily all have no pubic hair. Some of them do and some of them don't. So I wonder if that might change or is changing with the greater variety of pornography that's out there now.
Those are some questions that a lot of people speculate about and we know very little about. Absolutely. So people keep saying, oh, internet superhighway. And I was like, well, show me the superhighway then. Let's do some of those studies where we're actually looking at high exposure to a wide variety of stimuli. We tend just not to do that. And it's in part, those are hard studies to do. The ethics boards would balk at showing something that was coercive. I've been actually blocked from doing that kind of research myself. I had a university that prohibited me from showing a rape film when we wanted to investigate its effects. And so it's very difficult to get good answers to that kind of information, partially because of some of the design issues and then also some of the ethics around doing that type of research.
Well, Nikki, thank you so much. This has been a really, really interesting conversation. I'm really grateful for you coming out to talk about this. As a final question, a lot of my guests, they usually have something that they want to promote or contact information that they want to share. Is there anything that you would like to put out there? Any research you're doing? Anything at all that you'd like to share with the audience?
Sure. I think the thing I'm most excited about research-wise these days is we've just started some of these trials using brain stimulation to alter sexual desire levels, and those changes are thought to be semi-permanent. So we're predicting starting clinical trials here in Los Angeles in a few months, and I hope if you have the inclination or the curiosity that there may be an opportunity for patients who are qualified for those trials if they're interested. So it's a week-long intervention. So that would be an odd vacation, but you could make that happen. So this may be limited more for people who are local, but if you know someone in the area, we will be recruiting for that study probably soon.
Okay, great. And do you have a link or anything or contact information at this point that I can share?
Yes, so we'll be writing about that on liberoscenter.com, so LIBEROS Center, all one word, .com, to describe the study qualifications and also more about what we would be asking you to do.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nikki. I'll definitely put that link in the show notes. And thanks again for coming on today.
And thank you so much for the chance to talk through some of these interesting topics.
There you have it, guys. I hope that you found this very informative. As always, you can get in touch with me at alec@mensdatingmastery.com. That's Alec with a C. Let me know what's up, share what's on your mind. Or if you'd like to learn more about MDM, you can visit mensdatingmastery.com. And if you're enjoying the show, then please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on iTunes or in whatever your favorite podcast directory is. Your honest feedback and encouragement is extremely valuable to the future success of this show, and I appreciate all your voices. Thanks for listening, and until next time.
Thank you for listening to Men's Dating Mastery, a podcast dedicated to improving the lives of men and the women around them.